wonderful introduction. There's a scene near the end of Nymphomaniac Volume 2 that serves as a pretty apt synecdoche for a representation of the entire film. In the scene, the titular character Jo is telling the story of her sexual escapades to a sort of monk-like figure who has rescued her from near death. This particular story is about her time as a kind of sexual extortionist, where she's using her erotic prowess to extract payment from her past due accounts. So this particular account, Jo's been trying to unsuccessfully find the middle-aged man's weakness. And in the past, she's been using torture, which has worked well, or destroying property, that's also worked well, but not with this particular man. He seems unshaken by every tactic Jo employs. But she decides to pull down his pants, takes out his penis, and decides that this is a very reliable truth detector. Should he get hard during one of her many stories of sexual deviations, she knows his weakness and she can use this against him. So it's not until that she begins telling a fictional story of the man engaging with a child on a playground and taking the child home to have sex with him that he begins to get an erection. When the man cries out for her to stop and that he'll pay, she drops to her knees and gives him a blowjob. Seligman, the monk-like figure to whom she recounts the story, is in shock. How could you possibly do this? This is crazy. That pig, he says, excuse me. But Jo explains that she took pity on him because she knew that he'd never actually hurt anyone. I think that's laudable, she says. Seligman scoffs at the idea. I can't find anything laudable in pedophilia. But Jo's response is simple. She says, quote, "That's because you think about the perhaps 5% who actually hurt children. The remaining 95% never live out their fantasies. Think about their suffering. Sexuality is the strongest force in human beings. To be born with a forbidden sexuality must be agonizing. The pedophile who manages to get through life with the shame of his desire while never acting on it deserves a bloody medal. But there was another reason for my sympathy which you find so mysterious. I saw a man who was carrying the same cross as myself. Loneliness. We were both sexual outcasts." Unquote. Sussman and Sussman, in their 2011 Lit Review considering the definition of addiction, they outlined 5 elements of addiction, and Jo certainly exhibits all of them, trying to achieve appetitive effects, preoccupation, satiation, loss of control, and negative consequences. But the two authors barely mention the simultaneous loneliness and kinship that go along with an addiction like nymphomania. This is a strange and sort of disruptive paradox that's present both in the film and really in Sussman and Sussman's work. Indeed, I believe Lars von Trier's 2013 magnum opus, Nymphomaniac Volume 1 and 2, is challenging and disrupting conventional notions of sex, breaking through the patriarchal, hegemonic framing of sex that exists almost like a terministic screen for many people in modern society. I'm using terministic screen as Kenneth Burke does here. In Nymphomaniac, sex is messy, it's violent, it's destructive, it's dramatic, it's epic, it's beautiful, it's even funny at times. And yet the film is totally unsexy. For God's sake, it's a 4-hour film about people having sex, and it's not sexy. I think that's because the film is wrapped up in itself. It's confusing, it's distorting things, it's convoluted, it's complicated, almost at every turn. This makes for quite the curious text. So, today I'm going to talk about how von Trier, the infamous provocateur who uses unsimulated sex in this somewhat avant-garde film, utilizes a few cinematic mechanisms to disrupt the sexual inequality in the current status quo. So, 2 prominent mechanisms I'll discuss today are the film's interest in ego-centered protest rhetoric, and then I'll also talk about superimposed graphics. I'll argue that Nymphomaniac is participating in a kind of masturbatory edging. It's frustrating audiences to get us to undo the social constructs of sex today and release ourselves from hegemonic bondage. I should note that double entendres are absolutely intentional all throughout my speech. I provided a brief summary of the plot of Nymphomaniac, but let me give a quick recap. Basically, it's a story within a story. So the film starts with Seligman, that monk-like figure, who's a self-proclaimed asexual bibliophile, finding Joe beaten and unconscious in the alley outside his home. So he takes her in, and she explains over the course of the film sort of all of her sexual escapades and what brought her to end up in this alley. So the film goes back and forth between Seligman's home, where Joe's recounting that story of her very first orgasm through to today, and then the flashbacks of Joe's sexual encounters happening, quote-unquote, real time. The film shows a lot of people engaged in a lot of eroticism, since Joe is played at various ages by different actresses. But the overall effect of this sex is a feeling of total indifference at best. I mean, it's disgust at worst. That is, it's not sexually gratifying for the viewer. The moments at which I felt most sympathetic for these flawed characters are also sometimes the most difficult to watch. Right? There's the pedophile scene, a moment when Jo, at her father's bedside, lubricates as her father dies. There's another scene, the total abandon that she experiences, and the only induced orgasm in the entire film when she's with a sadomasochistic dominator. And the last moment of the film, when she kills Seligman after he sneaks into her room, is masturbating over her, and tries to have sex with her. The similarity among all these scenes is that there's a release, a conclusion, a reward for defying societal control. Right? The tantric-like pleasure delaying finally sees an end, and that's kind of satisfying. These moments are also the ones during which the sexual status quo is challenged. The sympathy for a pedophile, the erotic nature of major life events like death, the gratifying moment when a woman takes control over her sexuality, and finally when Seligman, the male father figure, dies for his instinctual maleness. I don't know how else to say it. Sexual hegemony, beware. There are lots of cinematic mechanisms that challenge the man, most prominently this kind of ego-centered rhetoric. Roger Ebert, in his review of Volume 1, remarked, "Part of the delight in Nymphomaniac is its disinterest in being anything other than a film about itself." And absolutely, when I quoted it, it really did seem like there were these sort of ego-rific moments peppered throughout the film. So Richard Gregg talks about in his writing this idea of protest rhetoric and how ego functions in protest rhetoric. And he says there are three main functions of the ego when discussing self-addressed discourse. So the first one, the ego formation and the building stage. The second one, the ever-continuing process of maintaining ego. The third is the ego being destroyed. It's not a stretch, of course, to talk about ego in a film with the title and about a very self-centered addiction. But the mechanisms in the film that represent these three stages are equally important. So first, Jo gives birth to her son, Marcel, creating personhood, fulfilling the first of Gregg's conditions. Second, Jo is bound by Marcel, her son, constantly reminded of her selfhood and her desire to break from her responsibilities and maintenance of Marcel. That's Gregg's second condition. And the third, in the director's cut of Volume 2, Jo performs a gruesome and painful abortion on herself. So she's, of course, ultimately destroying a part of herself, Gregg's third condition. So why is von Trier doing this? Well, I think he's making us reconsider our traditional notions of motherhood as beautiful, innately miraculous and wonderful, and it works. Marcel holds Jo back from sexual ecstasy, and while we feel bad for the child when she completely abandons him, we actually feel worse for her because the babysitter doesn't show up to relieve her of her burden. The second mechanism that I want to discuss today is the use of superimposed graphics. That is, at various times there's a diagram or there's numbers or formula or other mathematics going on the screen overlaid on top of the mise en scène. So for example, when Jo loses her virginity to a schoolmate, Jerome, who thrusts into her 3 times, and flips her over and thrusts into her 5 times, with each thrust there's this superimposed graphic of the number. 1, 2, 3, plus sign. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's very strange. At another point, Jo is parallel parking a car, and while she's parallel parking, there's a diagram overlaid on top of the mise en scène that sort of shows the method by which one might parallel park a car. The effect of all this superimposed stuff is kind of mathematicization, a routinization, a standardization of power relations, right? So in the sex scene, the schoolboy Jerome is wielding his sexual power over Joe. In the parking scene, it's actually the reverse. Joe is recapturing some of that power that she lost and wielding it over Jerome. The use of mathematical equations and Fibonacci numbers as a mechanism for flexing power is totally weird, I get it. But I ventured two guesses about why the film might be doing this. So here's guess number one. I can imagine that the bulk of the audience is not totally familiar with mathematics and mathematical formula. Correct me if I'm wrong. If this is the case, then this kind of esoteric posturing, it actually frustrates audiences, perhaps as a means of critiquing the inequality of power. Here's my other guess, though. It's quite the opposite. If von Trier is mathematicizing things, power, sex, gender, he's essentially making for a more concrete right and wrong, a worldview that privileges the quantitative, the empirical data. The key to ensuring the efficacy of empirical evidence, of course, is you have to be able to retest it and reproduce your results. So perhaps von Trier wants us to enact this reproduction on our own. Yes, pun still intended. So in conclusion, there's a lot going on in Nymphomaniac. And I think the film does this to be a kind of exercise in tantric sex. It's edging, it's delaying gratification and enduring discomfort, all of us, for hours on end. It's a 4-hour film. The result of this postponement is an even more vigorous and satisfying payoff if the audience can enact the dismantling of the sexual hegemony and oppression that it's criticizing. So, like the pedophile at the end of the film, von Trier sympathizes with the oppressed and the suppressed and asks that we all fight back against it. Thank you.